Max Bergman. I'm the director of the Europe program and Stewart Center here at CSIS. We're very delighted to have you here. Thank you all for coming out on a Friday and for all those joining us online. We are honored to host Andrew Small, Senior Transatlantic Fellow with the German Marshall Fund's Asia program, for a conversation with myself and Lily McElwee, a fellow with CSIS's Freeman Chair in China Studies program. We're here to discuss Andrew's upcoming book. It's not upcoming anymore, actually. It's here. It's available. Go buy it. Go purchase it. It's called No Limits: The Inside Story of China's War with the West. It is a story. It is a story about the riveting and mostly untold story about the battle for financial and technological power and mastery between the West and China over the last decade. And it could not be more timely, with the U.S. putting in place export controls against China's semiconductor industry and intensifying geopolitical competition between the United States, Europe, and China. But I think one of the most astonishing things about the book, and I think this is its real intellectual feat, is that it somehow incredibly makes think tank work seem incredibly exciting. As Andrew goes four corners of the world, he's in bars in China, drinking with Chinese officials, then he's here in Washington, and it makes it all sound very glamorous. So whenever I will get down about think tank work, I'm going to pick up this book and remind me of how exciting our lives can be at times. I will turn to Andrew in a moment, but let me just say a few words about his background. Andrew is with GMF's Asia program, which he established in 2006. His research focuses on U.S.-China relations, Europe-China relations, Chinese policy in South Asia, and broader developments in China's foreign and economic policy. He was based in GMF's Brussels office for 5 years and worked before that as the director of the Foreign Policy Center's Beijing office as a visiting fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So Andrew really brings the perspective of both a European perspective, knows Washington and the U.S. perspective, but also China's. Also with me for the discussion is Lily McElwee. She serves as a fellow in the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here. She also supports the CSIS Chumer Global Dialogue, a high-level dialogue project on strategic competition in the future of the world order, and her research focuses on global governance, EU-China relations, and transatlantic cooperation on China. So we're both going to grill Andrew. But before we do that, let me invite Andrew to the podium to talk about the book, and then we'll have a good conversation. Thank you, Andrew.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Max. I'm very pleased that my glamorous think tank life has brought me back to CSIS again. Delighted people were able to join this today. The book, as Max suggested, covers quite an array of different bits and pieces, but given this venue and program we're doing this with here at CSIS, I'm going to focus particularly on the kind of European dimension of this today. And I mean, stepping back from this, I think the speed with which this very different consensus has emerged on China in the West is actually quite remarkable. Without being prompted by a single catalytic event, an economic shock, an invasion, a really broad swathe of countries across the industrialized world revisited their fundamental assumptions on China, started overhauling their policies that had governed their approach for decades, and are now openly cooperating with each other in their collective response. When you go back a few years, the idea that China would be dubbed a systemic rival, which is now so widespread that policymakers now almost use the term casually, when it appeared in an EU strategy paper in 2019, it was then seen as kind of the bleeding edge of what was possible. Now it's part of pretty much the conceptual furniture. It appears in G7 and NATO communiques and op-eds by the German Chancellor almost as a matter of routine. And this is really a dramatic shift. I've worked on the China-Europe relationship longer than I've worked on, I think, any other area of Chinese foreign policy. And I've been engaged in transatlantic exchanges on China pretty much since the mid-90s, quite a lot of them here in DC. And for most of that period, when the US-China relationship was characterized by military balancing and a fairly significant level of cooperation on the economic and technological sphere, Europe was frankly extremely peripheral for any US policymaker working on Asia. I still remember one US official turning up to one of our events and being asked, what can Europe usefully do when it comes to China, and kind of looking around a bit and then going, don't lift the arms embargo. And for a long time, that was kind of the one important thing. What struck me in the first 2 years of the Trump administration was just how much more Europe was going to matter to US-China strategy, whether policymakers in DC or in Europe really realized that or not. That essentially, if we were entering a phase in which economic, technological, and even ideological competition with China was going to be at the core of the US approach, the idea that this was just going to be about US allies in the Indo-Pacific was way off the mark, given the huge concentration of economic, financial, regulatory, and technological power on the other side of the Atlantic. And so I sort of set out back then, it was kind of late 2018, to write a book that just tried to make sense of how the thinking in Europe had really been moving, particularly to try to dispel quite a lot of the lazy shorthand. Europe is too divided to have a China policy, Europe is only commercially motivated, all these kind of excessive focus that you had at points on the 17+1 or Hungary, and instead to try and lay out for, particularly for a US policy audience, a lot of the complexities of what was going on there. But within really a couple of months of embarking on this research project, the 5G drama, which the book spends a lot of time on, blew up, which would soon turn into the biggest political campaign that the US had ever run on a China-related issue in Europe. The German Business Association, the BDI, brought out this very striking paper labeling China a systemic competitor, not what you would have expected from the source that it came from. And then the EU emerged, as I had mentioned, with this even more remarkable paper calling China a systemic rival, which, instead of then being torn apart by European leaders, including Viktor Orban, in the discussion afterwards, they all signed off on. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that what's taken place since then is a complete revolution in how Europe thinks and deals with China, and how Europe and the United States deal with each other on China. And so one of the things I wanted to do in the book was basically to chronicle this kind of hinge period in dynamics between China and the major industrialized democracies, and to try to disentangle a bit what was actually driving those changes. Because I think it's quite easy to blob a lot of these things together. You can basically do this list that goes Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Belt and Road, Made in China 2025, Taiwan, Xi's authoritarianism, and say, well, this kind of collective set of things is what happened. Of course, policy was going to look different as a result of that. But so much of this was cumulative. It only prompted very incremental changes, and we went through this very long period in which we were seeing a lot of these phenomena unfolding on the Chinese side, but there was very little going on that really changed the approach. I think you needed some quite serious shocks to translate this into action. The book basically traces three of these, with 5G and the Trump administration's big rethink, the pandemic, and then this no limits agreement with Russia on the eve of war, which then kind of forms the book's title over here. But you needed this serious pivot in the analysis as well, this shift from seeing China as kind of a soft authoritarian state to something that looked a lot more totalitarian under Xi Jinping, and this convergence of views that the book describes, whether it was from the Department of Defense on the one hand to the BDI, ostensibly at the other end of the spectrum, that China's technological catch-up was going to pose military threats to our economic future far faster than people had expected, and that it was the very openness of our system that was making this possible. I still think there's a significant amount you can read about where dynamics between China, Europe, and the US were going to go, just by going back to Bob Work's speech at NATO from 2016 and following a lot of the logic of that analysis through. China's catching up. It's doing so through access to commercial technologies, and that technology base is not just in the US, it spans the industrialized world. So if you want to devise policies to deal with that, you essentially need to devise policies for the whole system, the critical parts of which are US allies in Europe and in Asia. whether it came to 5G, where the only Huawei competitors were European, or some of these recent moves that Max referenced on semiconductors, where it's the Dutch and the Japanese that are the most critical to have on board. This sort of ally-centered US approach to China strategy that is now talked about so much was not just a matter of choice, that the US has this great network of partners and allies, and this gives us an edge over China. This was really a matter of necessity. When the Trump administration invested such huge political energy in Europe on the telecoms issue, it wasn't because they were so excited that Europe was now calling China a systemic rival. It was because this was the only way of running an effective policy on this pretty foundational problem. And what we've seen since then have been these two parallel, somewhat messy processes of coalition building that I think are still really in their early stages. The first part of it is, can a coalition that cuts across major industrialized democracies get critical elements of their approach roughly in line with each other in light of China's rise? And there's a huge difference there between getting our China policies roughly in line, which is actually not the hardest bit, and adjusting a whole series of other policies that are not just about China, but where China conditions those choices very differently. Trade strategy, infrastructure and development policy, privacy, supply chain, subsidies, everything around what risks and exposures we expect from our major multinationals. And on this, the kind of agenda that is often subsumed into things like the Trade and Technology Council, I'd say we're making much slower progress. Although we talk about systemic rivalry, I think we're still inclined to see the differences between our own models in Europe and the US within the free market liberal democracies as having at least as much importance as those with China itself. The second process of coalition building, though, is another one that the book looks at, which is the one on the Chinese side. We've seen this real sea change in thinking about non-alignment in Chinese strategy. And I think what I'd still characterize as the relative failures to read developments in the China-Russia relationship in recent years, which I think we're now somewhat on the verge of repeating, is probably just another encapsulation of what happens when we get that analysis wrong. I think our approach had largely been to be dismissive of what was possible, to define China's relationship, particularly with Russia, more by their limitations than by looking at how conditions might shift and make it necessary to start pushing past them. We saw that on high-end weapons sales, on energy, on Chinese support for Russian positions in Europe, and a host of other areas. I think we're now going through this again somewhat in the process of saying, but there are limits. The two sides have their differences, rather than again focusing on some of the areas where the two sides are likely again to push forward areas of cooperation beyond some of their prior restrictions. I think we're also often quite hung up on formal treaty alliances in our thinking about what alliance kind of competition looks like. We don't always invest as much in looking at the very distinct models that China is defining instead, this kind of quasi-alliance approach that they're starting to model at the moment, that I think is going to be even more important as we look out on what the Global Security Initiative amounts to, and this phase in which China now genuinely wants something that looks like a global network of military bases. The book looks at why translating even some of the very close relationships into a new model have proved so difficult for China too, even with very friendly governments everywhere from my old stomping ground in Pakistan to the Maldives. I certainly don't think it's remotely easier for Beijing to pull together an effective coalition than it is for the United States. But I think these are going to be the big structuring developments in the years ahead, not US-China rivalry alone. And one of the book's main themes is really why great power rivalry is the wrong starting point. But rather this struggle of competing systems and coalitions with each other and their relations with this long list of states that don't fit into either camp. Very last point on the book. One of the things I trace as well is how far the shifts on China in Europe have been driven by what are the kind of so-called disillusioned doves rather than hawks. You've seen a lot of pretty analytically clinical people in the intellectual and business communities in Europe turning into real activists in the last few years. A lot of the people that were closest, biggest advocates for cooperation between China and Europe in years past. And I think there's still quite a strong sense among this group that although the adjustments to the new reality are very much underway, the level of urgency is often lacking, and there's still a significant element of relying on old ways of thinking about how the Chinese system works that no longer hold true. I think this is still quite evident across parts of the political class in Europe. So although I and the book talk about this as a revolution, I think it's one that's very much still incomplete. And anyone watching the G20 in Bali can very much see both elements in play. The kind of united front on issues such as Taiwan that would have been absolutely impossible to imagine a few years ago, and then the wishful thinking on China and Russia that I think will still not go away. And I'll finish up there and look forward to more of the discussion. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Andrew, for that really thorough overview. It's sort of hard to know where to start, but maybe I'll start with a question, then I'll turn it over to Lily. I sort of come at this book more from the European-Russia angle, and with the war in Ukraine, there's been this sort of constant sort of navel-gazing debate amongst Russia hands over what did the U.S. Did the U.S. and the West help cause the friction between the United States and Russia? Was it NATO expansion? And there's this constant sort of effort to kind of reanalyze the kind of last 30 years of what went wrong and who's to blame. In your book, it seems pretty clear, and you just mentioned it with the disillusioned doves, that there was real effort to engage China, but it's China that has turned away. Do you think there are things that the West made a mistake or could have done, or how would you sort of assess kind of that sort of blame game? I'm not saying the China hands should replicate what the Russia hands and Europe hands have been doing, but I'm curious if how you sort of see who's to blame for the rupture.
I mean, I think that is the big, interesting differentiation between some of those debates on Russia and on China. I don't think there is a huge amount of navel-gazing among most of the China hands on this question. I think there is a sense, maybe that leans too far, that a lot of this came down to decisions and processes that looked quite different under Xi Jinping. And a lot of the developments there. I think it's very easy to imagine still, even under Xi, if you looked at the kind of early time in his first term, you could still see trajectories and decisions that could have broken in slightly different directions, and where you'd have had a very different balance on relations, certainly between China and Europe, but obviously China and the US as well. And if you talk to a lot of the officials engaged in these negotiations who wanted actually to move things in a sort of tougher direction in the way that ultimately happened, you look at the negotiation, the US-China free trade or the comprehensive trade deal and the decision to pull back on the deal that Liu He had negotiated. You see some of the decisions not to go ahead with the approach that was taken to Huawei and Meng Wanzhou. There are a couple of these moments where, and then of course how the pandemic itself was handled on the Chinese side. So I think still, even under Xi Jinping, you could have had things breaking in a slightly different way. But I think the sense is rather that there was on the European side in particular, people really pushed to the limits of and well beyond the limits of hoping that you could induce different results by still, despite themselves, trying to figure out bilateral agreements of different sorts. You still have this kind of death zone thing with the comprehensive agreement on investment that the EU and China negotiated well after the fact that anyone still thought that this really made sense. And so I think there's less of that kind of view there that there were big mistakes made on the European side, and that things could be. I think there's a different debate on this to some extent. It balances differently in the US on some of these questions, but certainly in Europe, I think there's the sense of culpability tends to fall in one place. There's very little of that agonizing.
Great.
I think both Max and I were struck by the central role that the COVID-19 pandemic plays in your narrative. And I pick up on that now because you have this great line where you say, there was long a perception that China was a revisionist power, but not an actively destructive one. And China's behavior during the pandemic, in terms of exploiting Europe's pain at the time for disinformation campaigns, propaganda campaigns, for-profit sales of PPE to Europe. All of that kind of broke the conception that during times of crisis, cooperation can occur between the EU and China, and it does. And China puts geopolitics aside in a way that it did in 9/11, Eurozone crisis, global financial crisis. So I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about how, we talk about, you were talking about all of these buildups, the Xinjiang issue, the Hong Kong issue, the South China Sea crisis. All of this is cumulative into a narrative of shifting views. But the COVID pandemic was, in a way, a more of a global crisis, where China's cooperation really mattered. Can you tell us a little bit more about what effect did that have as a shock on your
I think it's very important, and I think in Europe, because I think you have a number of these crises that are global, and where China's behavior in the aftermath and the handling of it, this kind of constant, we will be the important issue that you deal with further down the line, but look, in the immediate urgent crisis issue, we're going to be at least not a problem and often quite helpful. And so you go through the aftermath of 9/11, the global financial crisis, but in Europe, the Eurozone crisis, I think, is quite a shaping period on this. China comes in a number of these countries, and it doesn't do a huge amount. It just comes out and makes some sort of positive statements about the reasons to continue to buy these countries' bonds and things like that. But it's really appreciated at this moment. Even some of these investments that subsequently became extremely contentious in Portugal, in Greece, and places like that, at that moment, these were kind of votes of confidence still in some of these economies. And so you have that, which convulses Europe for an extraordinary length of time, where at a moment where I think there are these different junctures where you're potentially going to have these rebalances of thinking. And again, China defaults back to actually it's at least not a problem and to some extent constructive. You look at Crimea as well, where you have something that looks genuinely like neutrality on the Chinese side. And so everyone had come to expect this, that this was also kind of hardwired into the way the party thought, that it was kind of, you need to manage global affairs like this, your important markets need to be kept stable, and so take care in these situations. And to a certain extent, that these channels, Merkel and whoever she was dealing with at the time, French leaders, German leaders, European leaders, can still, at these times of crisis, kind of pull together and figure things out. And that's why I think COVID was quite a shock. That was the first crisis where you got this very, very different response on the Chinese side. You have this line from Macron when the French are giving all of this kind of top-grade PPE equipment to the Chinese. They'll remember it when the time comes, and then the time comes, and they did not remember it. They did precisely the opposite at that moment, and then kind of really moved to exploit some of these dynamics. I think there was a bit of shock in Europe as well. It's like, hang on, this is a US-China thing. We were nice. Why are we being subjected to all of these attacks on kind of Western democracy and the failings of Western democracy? France being a very good example of that. The Chinese embassy, doing all of these kind of extraordinary pieces of work in that regard. And I think this has then been the challenge in the thinking. There's been an understanding that this is just a dynamic between powers and things like that. Whereas on the Chinese side, this systemic thinking that this was about proving the, and particularly MDC, proving the superiority of the Chinese system versus the Western liberal free democratic system. That was what actually mattered at this juncture. And I think that shock, therefore, the idea that you can't rely on China at these critical moments still plays out if you're thinking about supply chain issues and things. It wasn't that even then that it was necessarily the case that China massively exploited its position in supply chains, but you could see in worse situations just how bad this might have been, and you could see the different kind of spirit within which this was being approached. And so I think the sense, of course, this gets heavily reinforced during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which then absolutely confirmed that this was going to be the case during future crises.
You mentioned, you sort of outlined kind of an under-the-radar engagement with China, in some ways, with Europe, that China, with its 16+1 with Eastern Europe, its engagement with Italy, its purchase of the Port of Piraeus in Greece, that China was an actor, but there was sort of it hadn't yet sort of fully emerged as a real strategic conversation between Europe and the United States to this sort of transition to wolf warrior diplomacy. It seemed like China would have had more success if it had just stayed on that course. Why didn't it? Why did it become more aggressive in its diplomatic engagement with Europe?
I think this is still, I mean, you can go through and do this entire analysis of how easy it would have been for China, particularly during the Trump presidency, at a moment where, in one sense, political relations with Europe were ripe to be exploited at this moment. And you had this kind of, obviously, sort of shock, particularly in Germany, but in a number of other European countries, about what the future relationship with the United States was going to look like. China could have stepped in quite easily during this period, modulating in its approach in various ways, offering various incentives, and locked in, I think, a very different relationship to what you saw. And this is the thing that really feels like, when you go through and you say, how much of these feel like decisions that Xi Jinping took that were ill-judged. And one can get hung up on this version of talking about the mistakes of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping doesn't think he's making mistakes. He keeps doing these things. There are obviously dynamics in China and in the system and in his thinking that say that actually there is a different framework through which this is supposed to be approached. There seems to have been a very, very much a sense of a kind of it's better to be feared than to be loved. If you can't be loved, kind of mindset that's gone into this. And so you have this kind of extraordinarily coercive approach in all sorts of these cases instead. But it feels in some ways like the Chinese system had become more rigid, less nimble through this stretch. It'd be interesting right now to see whether it's able to kind of find its feet again a bit diplomatically. I think you've had this lock-in period, particularly through the COVID period, that's been, yes, you had the versions of just China should stand up for itself, stand up for its positions, lots of this refracted through to domestic audiences with the wolf warrior diplomacy, but then some judgments that I think were just, particularly as we've seen on the China-Russia relationship, very rigid at points in which China can actually play with these things and exploit them a bit more in dynamics with Europe in a way that they used to. So, I mean, I think right now, as we're seeing China looking to stabilize relations with the United States and Europe to an extent, we'll see whether they're able to kind of regain the nimbleness in their diplomacy on these things. But I think you just had a period in which this kind of the skills that you'd seen on Chinese economic and diplomatic side seem to have been instead relegated to a view that says you have to show China's strong voice in the world, you have to coerce countries rather than offering carrots, and this really cost them, I think, during a period in Europe in which a different approach could have yielded very different results.
Coming out of the 20th Party Congress, I don't necessarily see that Chinese approach changing. I mean, I think there's this idea that the geostrategic picture for China is darkening, and as a result, we need to do many things, but one of them is to increase China's voice in the international system. And I wanted to pick up briefly on wolf warrior diplomacy. We've just discussed it a little bit, but Xi Jinping's showing at the G20 with Justin Trudeau was a pretty good reminder, straight out of the wolf warrior handbook, that this might not be changing anytime soon. So I'm wondering, you touched on it a bit in your book, but what was the effect of that? You know, I mean, some of the stories are just really remarkable. The tweets from, you know, the Chinese ambassador to Sweden and all of that. What role did that play in your narrative?
I mean, you have through this period as well this real shift in opinion across Europe, and I mean, none of the shifts that we're seeing reflect are more of a reflection of public opinion than politicians driving it. I mean, Sweden is a good example of this. You just have this total collapse in positive views of China in Sweden, and the Swedish approach to this was quite kind of moderate in the scheme of things. It would also seem to be a country in terms of technology access, in terms of a neutrality tradition. And there are all sorts of reasons why Sweden was actually a relatively benign kind of environment. Should have been relatively easy, I think, for China to maintain a certain sort of relationship. And then you have the handling of the case of Gui Minhai, but then the behavior of the ambassador there, Gui Tongyu, who just kind of, again, extraordinary, needlessly aggressive approach that still has seemed to find favor in the system. None of the wolf warrior diplomats have been punished. They've continued to be rewarded. They're still showing up at the podium. I spent quite a bit of time on Zhao Lijian, who I knew in Pakistan, in the book, in this case. And this, it has in some countries had a real effect. They're not in every country in Europe. If you look in Germany, if you look at the ambassador in Brussels, it's had a very differentiated impact. I mean, there are, whether it's been by choice or by initiative of some of these officials, there's big gaps in how these things are being handled in different places. But in the places where they have had them, it's had a big effect. And the public opinion climate has changed what's politically possible and what's politically, I think, understood to be needed in a number of these countries. And I kind of describe as well in the book a new political class, a new group of politicians who never thought about China in the past and are coming along and looking at this, not involved in the relationship, and saying, this looks really bad, this looks really problematic, and we have public opinion on our side if we want to do anything different with this, and we need to we need to push our country's approach to these things in a very different direction. You saw that in Germany, you saw it in the UK, you saw it in a whole series of other cases, which had, again, a big impact on, for instance, the Huawei decisions. There were crucial decisions that I think reflected a shift in political opinion in these countries at important junctures, which a different handling of the kind of wider relationships in these cases could still have led to some quite different results.
Maybe we could talk a little bit more about Germany. Angela Merkel, when she was both Chancellor of Germany, but in her final stint as President of the European Council, when Germany had the EU presidency, pushed a trade and investment agreement with China over the line. China made a bunch of concessions right after the U.S. election, seemed sort of clearly intended to try to divide Europe and the United States when it came to China, and seemed to succeed. Only for it all to sort of implode, where the U.S. and Europe did sanctions against China for human rights violations. You know, in the book they were relatively minor, but China then responded with its vigorous sanctions against European parliamentarians, against think tanks, Merrick's. And now that agreement is completely stuck. Was that an example of China just not thinking strategically? It seems like a real own goal of wolf warrior diplomacy in response.
And again, this is one of the examples, though, where it looks like a mistake. It looks like an error of judgment. It would have been very easy. And you even saw some of the kind of voices on the Chinese side revving up to say, are these sanctions from the Europeans that were very mild? And so, you know, this actually shows that, you know, the comprehensive agreement on investment is going to be very successful. And look how weak. You started getting this material appearing on the Chinese side. And then even some of these people were surprised by how far the sanctions then went. But again, this goes back to there seems to be a view that says showing China's coercive power is more valuable. The kind of threat elements will have a more powerful effect. I think lots of people see this as a miscalculation. It's been very costly. I mean, if you go through every single one of these relationships in the last period of time, you go through in Europe, you look at Australia, you look at what played out on the border with India, there's a very long list through this period in which you think, why was this worth it for the sake of the wider relationship? What was it worth it that meant that you went ahead with these courses of action? But at no point was there an assessment that said, actually, this was somewhat ill-judged. You've had a kind of game on the sanctions in Europe in which there are sort of retired officials running around from the Chinese side saying, well, if you could pull back your sanctions first, we could do the same with all of these things. I think there are plenty of people on this, as on other areas, who understand that they went too far, that it undercut the last real push under Merkel to hold together a certain kind of part of the cooperative elements of the relationship, which was really what the the investment agreement amounted to. And then to just have that the kind of immediate slap on the face, in the face just a couple of months later on the Chinese side, and to make it impossible. I mean, they sanctioning members of the European Parliament who were going to have to vote through the comprehensive agreement on investment. I mean, this wasn't just about the opinion response to whether these sanctions were a good idea. Why were any of these people going to vote it through? And so they killed it themselves.
Can I just pick up on that? I mean, that was happening in the spring of 2021, and a lot of what you've discussed had already happened and shaped European public opinion and elite opinion to a certain degree that I wonder even if China hadn't sanctioned those EU officials, whether the CAI would have passed in any case.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, there wasn't a huge amount of enthusiasm for it.
Yeah.
Merkel pushed it through in the kind of dying days of their presidency of the EU, with very, very little support from around Europe. There was a willingness to defer to the fact that this had been agreed. People didn't even see everything that had been agreed. There were sort of certain things that went on the bilateral side that people weren't privy to as well on this. And I think there was a real concern. I mean, this was done with very clear intent on the Chinese side, spelt out and encapsulated in certain papers on the EU side to say it needs to be closed during this period because this is the kind of purdah period essentially between the two administrations. Because if they can push it through now, this will be effectively helpful for showing that this new coalition the Biden administration wants to put together is weak, or there's a crack, and so we should take advantage of this right now. And so everything about it was quite problematic, and there was both fierce attacks from all sorts of corners in Europe, but if you talk to a number of the industry associations, very, very little enthusiasm for it. No one was, when you said, are you going to lobby for this to certain of these industry associations in different countries and push it through? It was like, we'll sit this out. So I think there was very good reason to think that the whole thing could have unraveled in any case. But it was an important juncture where I don't think on the Chinese side, I mean, they could have then maneuvered and kind of made a real diplomatic push to get certain people in line. No one also wanted to be the big spoiler on it. And then China did that job itself.
I think I want to turn in a moment to kind of looking at the present and future of where relations are going. But one of the things that also struck me in the book is that you talk a lot about the struggle the Trump administration had to try to get the UK and Germans sort of aligned when it came to 5G and Huawei. But actually, one thread through the book is that the French have been much more concerned about China. At least that's the way it struck me. I'm curious how you would characterize the French position when it came to China and what their role has been to try to craft an EU-wide policy.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a very interesting debate about that in the coming months with the Macron visit, and there's a very kind of Macron-specific question about this, which we can talk about. But when the Trump administration sent its first big delegation to Europe, it sent it to Paris. It sent this kind of big interagency delegation because actually on a lot of critical areas on the Indo-Pacific, I think the French were understood to be actually the most useful partner on a whole series of these things. And there was kind of quite a high level of convergence on thinking, despite the fact that in other ways, on a lot of these big decisions, and including going back to, as I was talking about earlier, the how far should Europe and the US be differentiated when it comes to certain strategic economic questions, France is clearly almost in a camp by itself on the strategic autonomy above all, and don't go too close on a whole series of areas of alignment that might actually be useful for collectively pulling together on these things. But I mean, the decisions on critical infrastructure and things like that on the French side were then just made without quietly, straightforwardly, clear assessment of the security threats, none of the drama that played out with the Brits or the Germans on this. And I think this was then the thing with a lot of the Huawei. I mean, the French case is particularly clear in that regard. But you had this big psychodrama in various countries on this, and big battles and things, which all pretty much ended in the same place. They were still looking at how much Huawei is actually in the build out of German 5G networks even now. But the countries that were able to make the decisions just on their own assessment of the national security risks straightforwardly. I mean, if you talk to the French back when you had the golden era on the UK China relations, the sorts of investments that were being allowed during that period when George Osborne was Chancellor, I thought it was crazy what was being allowed. And so I think the funny thing is, if you say what is the paradigm for the European relationship with China that has kind of tended to stick and that is defining of the European approach, it is the French one. It It is actually more a French approach that says we were too open, we need to be attuned to certain security risks, we need to have greater kind of strategic capacity on the economic side to respond in the right way. Lots of this was an outlook that had been there on the French side a number of years back. And I remember going and talking to a French Treasury official about this. It's kind of, this is all going your way, isn't it? This is kind of your model for where you wanted. You know, we won't say that, but and I think that's the center of gravity on European policy looks like an approach that you could have had mapped out in certain respects on the French side a number of years back. But you have the big transatlantic piece of this, which I think, you know, where there's still a huge amount of tension on what that balance should look like in Europe, and where I think France is still in something of a minority position on what that should be, particularly after the war. And then you have this very kind of what is Macron doing question on these things, and of course a system that is so presidentially centered. What Macron thinks about these things is a critical question, and you had this kind of peculiar baton passing thing between Merkel and Macron in this final year, and almost this view that seemed to be there that was, you know, someone needs to hold the old relationship together, some strand of it, that you still need these channels, someone needs to do this, and to some extent, it looked as if Merkel was sort of handing this off to Macron to do that. And you can see in some of the diplomacy, we may see this in January, still this view that is, you know, this unique role that can perhaps be played in this regard. And we'll see a little bit between Scholz and Macron of the tussles about who should occupy that position. But I think stepping back from that, your question is very much on the mark in terms of kind of where France actually was on all of these things at an earlier date.
Can I ask a slightly esoteric question, but one that I think is important as the EU crafts a China strategy and the EU and the US seek to build transatlantic cooperation on China? And that question is, what does systemic rivalry with China mean to Europe? And I ask that because toward the end of your book, you quote another China expert who says, every few months I'm asked, is this the moment that really changes everything? 5G, COVID, Hong Kong, Russia, but then nothing quite changes as much as it should. And there's a normative element to that. So, you know, what is there any consensus? Oh, sure. Is there any consensus within the capitals of Europe, but also within Europe, about what the end goal of systemic rivalry should be?
Yeah, I think this is still this problem because we use this terminology about systemic rivalry, and then what is the system is, I think, still one of the most important question. There's a lot that's elusive about this. People can interpret some of this how they wish. I mean, if you take the German chancellery on this, there are points in which you sometimes see a version of it that is essentially, you know, we are partners, we're competitors, we're rivals on some different areas. So this means we can do cooperation on all of these things in a completely straightforward way. There's some economic competition, but we're also values rivals, so we'll raise some human rights issues, and that will be kind of what that amounts to. That's the sort of systemic rivalry bit. And I mean, that's a caricature in one way, but there is a view that on some bits of Europe that this sort of all of these things very happily coexist. They're just different tracks. The relationship is complex. There is another view that, I mean, I kind of mentioned the SPD China paper, and I think more the mainstream view that says systemic rivalry conditions everything, even areas of ostensible cooperation, climate being the kind of classic example on this, where, in fact, if you look at, you know, green energy industries and things like that, there's fierce competition between Europe and China when it comes to the future of these industries. We already had it with solar, we're getting it with wind at the moment. The idea that green transition is an area of just happy cooperation is clearly far off the mark. But I think the sense that competition and rivalry are conditioning on all of these things, I think that has stuck. But I think this question of what does it in the end really mean, the systemic piece of this, whose system, and this comes back to then I mean, there's two parts to that. One is, do we mean a system that is roughly the advanced industrial democracies? Are we, in the end, trying to devise policies collectively for this system? How open should this collective system be? You know, access to technologies, access to advanced research, access to, you know, our trade open, a whole series of these questions. Or are we really talking about kind of a European system, a US system that are differentiated, and that part of it? And then the other, I mean, are we talking about something that is just this democracies versus autocracies kind of struggle on these things. And of course, we've kind of moved away from that being the kind of the way that I think anyone thinks it makes sense to define this as. But there is a core piece of this that is understood, I think, on the Chinese side, and I think still, whether it's used for kind of public purposes or not, a lot of the core of the battle is between a version of things that is China taking on, with certain authoritarian partners, a liberal democracy at its heart, and that is kind of a critical piece of this. But I don't think you have a total alignment in views and understanding of what it means to talk about systemic rivalry, systemic challenge. It's used as a kind of catch-all at the moment, going back to that kind of blob of things that I mentioned before. We don't like any of this. We are systemic rivals. Okay, I mean, everyone, that kind of makes sense, but what does that translate into as in policy application? Because I think these definitions are quite critical when it goes back to this. Are you really going to define policies for a system, or are you going to define them for Europe alone? And I think the biggest concern still, in terms of the capacity to really pull together on this, is that the instincts land a bit more towards that latter direction.
I want to maybe dive into that a little bit more, and then ask Lily a question about the future of U.S.-China relations, given Biden and Xi have just met. But for you, Andrew, I want to maybe, you really pull out in the book, I think, a number of very vivid anecdotes of, U.S. officials sort of not knowing who kind of owns the policy area when it comes to talking with the Europeans over these trade, tech, commercial issues that both involve needing to cooperate with Europe, but also engaging China. And we've seen an effort with the Trade and Technology Council where the U.S. trying to really sort of get the economic foreign policy side of the house coordinated and in order. And I can tell you, as being a former State Department official, we sometimes feel much more comfortable on the security side or working with the Pentagon. But when it comes to dealing with the Commerce Department, we're sort of a little bit out to sea. And now we're on the cusp of what could be the first big climate trade war between the U.S. and Europe over the Inflation Reduction Act, which was sort of a miraculously passed bill by the United States, but has the side effect of potentially discriminating against European companies. What prospects do you see for the U.S. and Europe to really get on the same page when it comes to the trade, technology, commercial issues that are so critical to having a kind of united front vis-a-vis China?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several problems in this. I mean, it has obviously been difficult. It still is difficult to get any of these systems that are not used to joining up all of these different kind of what were once lanes in different ways and integrating this. Chinese system, and even, I think, mode of thinking, I mean, actually, Marxist-Leninist mode of thinking is quite conducive to thinking in this way, but not just that version of things. If you, I could sit down with policy officials in Tokyo and get a view of how you fit these pieces together. It was always much more effective than the version of it that you would have in frameworks where the view on strategic economic issues, how security, technology, trade, how all of these pieces fitted together, which at some point are only integrated at the very, very top of a system, and in other places there's more intermediating layers that can do this stuff a bit more effectively. The US system was not good at this. European system, I'd say, was not so good at this.
I think better, though. I think the European system, at least.
Brussels was actually at certain junctures kind of like started to move in directions to integrate this kind of thinking. But you still, I mean, even now, I mean, if you look at DG Trade or something, which which can do certain slices of this, but you still, like, who are the people who are doing this? Trade lawyers and things like this. And what's been the mindset for what is it that matters in policy? It's not been the kind of geopolitical, geoeconomic dimensions of this. There's a huge effort, I think, now that is also barely underway in a whole series of our governments and systems to actually have the structures in place that can deal with this issue set, not just China, but the overall kind of landscape that China has conditioned, and how you fit these pieces together in a way that's effective. And so the idea of then being able to then negotiate with someone else fully in this space without defaulting to all of the old ways that you talk to each other. I mean, this was always the thing with the TTC and things like that. You would, in principle, you'd basically go back and you'd have the same conversations that were being had in past years between the same people on the same issues, and then the question was, how much does the China thing change it? Or how much do you get a different kind of political slap from the top that says, no, we really need to fix this now, this really matters? Or how far does this just get left to, you know, a version of negotiations that you saw back in the days of TTIP, or all of the previous iterations of what these exchanges actually looked like? I think they've done a good job. They've made a lot of progress in kind of aligning the systems to be able to talk to each other better. I think we saw that a lot with the Russia sanctions alone. I think, and the models that have been developed there are actually going to be quite useful when it comes to future application in some of the very problematic scenarios that we might see with China, particularly on sanctions, technology controls, things like that. I think we've got much better at it. But the really hard bit is precisely what you talk about with the Inflation Reduction Act and these sorts of things, where you've got huge interests on the two sides. You've got domestic politics in play on this that is difficult to bridge, and there hasn't been that level of political willingness fully on either side to really say that it matters enough that you push past in these areas some of the obstacles that mean that, I mean, in the end, the US is not now negotiating market access agreements with virtually anyone, for instance. And if you talk to German companies who are saying, you know, we want to do rebalancing, we want to do diversification, but you know, maybe the US piece of this, which is still going to be quite crucial, would be a part of that, and still finding that challenging. I think there's the need to be able to do real mutual openness and integration, which has just really not progressed in a particularly effective way at all, rather than the control elements, which I think have got better, the kind of counter kind of adjustment of the system openness, the kind of targeted things that we've seen in, and I mean, the export controls on semiconductors, which, you know, again, we'll go through the next year even on that with a set of questions for, you know, are we really, do we want to strike the right balance in the right place? But I'm more confident about where we come out on that than where we come out on the kind of core pieces of certain parts of the trade and economic relationship, subsidies, all of these things, which I think is just much harder to get over some of the political interests at stake. And I mean, this is what you got with, in the end, in Japan with Abe and TPP and things like that, this big push to say we need to overcome a whole series of these domestic, because the strategic stakes with China are too important to allow these to condition our policy. And I don't think we've really gone through that either in Europe or the US to the extent that we really need to.
Yeah. Lily, I want to turn to you, and then I'll turn to the audience for a couple questions. But you know, we've been talking about how U.S.-China relations and relations between Europe and China have sort of descended down. Where do you see them going now after the G20, after what seemed like a fairly positive meeting between Biden and Xi, and also Olaf Scholz's visit to Beijing? Maybe you could give your assessment.
Sure. Well, I think we are undeniably in an environment of mutual mistrust and blame in the U.S.-China relationship. And we were talking earlier about how a lot of the sentiment in the U.S. soured toward China much earlier than, a few years at least, earlier than it soured in Europe. And now it's about acting on that soured sentiment. And we've seen, you know, recent export controls done unilaterally. I think we're going to see more of that going ahead. I think we're going to see further controls on outbound investment from the United States to China, and a ratcheting up of protecting core U.S. technologies so that they don't benefit the Chinese military. I think the fact that Biden and Xi met itself was indicative of a slight dialing down of tensions, and certainly gave some hope to observers of this relationship. In a similar way that the Scholz visit did, I think Olaf Scholz and Biden, you know, didn't give much, but the fact that they met and they talked about some areas of potential cooperation is a good thing, and is defrosting those relationships a little bit. I think the question now is, I think we talk a lot about a Cold War scenario, and I certainly think that certain elements of the U.S.-China relationship will be in a Cold War scenario for some time to come, particularly the technological and economic elements. But I think the question is, even within that scenario, how much cooperation can occur on issues that are critical globally: climate change, global health, food and energy security for the developing world. I think that meeting gave us a little bit of hope that that element of the relationship can potentially come back in a way that it hasn't been there for the past few years.
Yeah. I want to turn to see if there's any audience questions. I think on climate, I think there's both a real hope that this could sort of be the new, what was arms control during the Cold War, but I also take Andrew's point that European and U.S. companies are also vigorously competing for what may be the next industry. Yes, ma'am. Please wait for the microphone, and if you could introduce yourself too.
Hello, I'm Dr. Elaine Serrao. First of all, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, and particularly uniquely positioned illumination from your experiences on the developments of China. I'd like to sort of tie together a couple of different things that were said, and I'd like to start actually with Germany, Schultz, China, the port, the most significant port in Germany, and one could say, therefore, major European port. And last comment was not giving away anything. I think Schultz did give something incredibly important that the Chinese obviously wanted desperately, to have a port in Europe. A port that happened that all of the German ministries was against, and other European governments looked at with surprise. And yet when he went, I think it leveraged something with the Chinese, with Xi specifically, of course, which helped with leveraging maybe other things. Could you comment on this dynamic of what it really means in the long term, especially with the fact that China does use its ports for global economic positioning and could use their ports for military positioning? Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question and the kind comments. I mean, I think the Hamburg decision was interesting in two respects. I mean, obviously it wasn't handing over complete control. Even the controlling, the stake was kind of pared down. We ended up with 24.9% in the final version of the agreement. But I mean, there were a couple of things that were significant. First of all, yes, there were a number of other ports in Europe where China already has stakes, and this was the kind of angle that was given by some of the people on the Hamburg end. I think there's been a shift in trying to assess these things on the basis of what does it look like in aggregate, rather than just looking at these on a case-by-case basis. What does this look like in terms of how far does China operate with a level of influence and power and over the entirety of the European port network? And this has been a very also a cumulative process if you look around the map. And I think this is where the Hamburg piece was a kind of specific concern, as it added another piece to this process. But it was also the sense that it came about in an atmosphere of political coercion. There were implicit threats being made by COSCO that essentially they'd take their business elsewhere if this stake was not sold. And we've kind of gone through this with Huawei, we've gone through this in other cases as well. The idea that you would make these decisions giving China a stake in your critical infrastructure because otherwise they would punish you economically, I think looked like a problematic dynamic in its own right. And so I think there was a lot of resistance from people, not just on the inherent security stakes of that level of Chinese kind of stake in the port, COSCO stake, but also what this meant in terms of the wider relationship. And coming, of course, just before the Schultz visit. And I'm not sure it was leveraged into anything particularly useful on the Chinese side. I think there is this view that you have to hold a certain kind of relationship together, otherwise China won't move on ABC, and I think that's kind of has fed into this. This is why the Russia question, the statement that China made on the use or threat of nuclear weapons use, I think was one of the things the Chancellor was leaning on as showing, look, this is, we can still get things from China on this. I'm still quite skeptical on what that actually amounted to. I do think China has got smarter right now at offering relatively concessions that have no material impact on Russian decision-making, but that it can be sold now in Europe as China being somewhat differentiated, somewhat helpful, and then on these other areas, port decisions, other elements of the bilateral relationship, well, you have to keep this kind of in a certain state because otherwise we won't get progress, we won't be able to engage effectively on this critical question of European security, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and things like that. And I think China's now, this, although generally speaking, I don't think they're so much more adept, you're locking into system struggle, all of these things. I think on some of these pieces, I think they're still capable of playing a game with this of a sort they played on a number of other cases of this sort in the past. And I fear that not just with the Scholz visit, but what we saw at the G20 and what we may see with the Macron trip are going to be kind of a repeat of falling into that trap that China's very good at using.
We're short on time. We'll take 2 more quick questions. Lily, did you want to comment also? I think Donna and then
I agree. I think right now we're seeing, you were talking about how China's position on Ukraine was another shock in the early days of Russia invading Ukraine, that no limits partnership. And right now, there are oh so subtle hints that Xi Jinping is trying to walk back a little bit, at least with European partners, from that position. And I think the open question is, to what degree can some of the mistrust that was bred from that initial position during the invasion, or right after the invasion, be won back? And I think that's an open question that we're seeing unfold every week now.
Yeah.
Maybe. My name is Dana Sinoi. I work here at CSIS, and I worked on China and the Balkans for the Europe program a couple years ago. Thank you for the really engaging conversation. I'm curious, in your mind, based on all the research that you did for this book and professionally, Max, you mentioned there's surely blame to be placed on some of the decisions, but it seems to me there's also quite a bit of human error involved. So I'm wondering what you think is the biggest misconceptions in Western policy circles about internal dynamics in China that create the move toward more coercive behavior and what we seem to not understand about internally in China.
we're going to take one more question and then we'll wrap up over here. Let me just say on Costco quickly as we're waiting for the mic to come over. I think the other thing is that it sets a precedent for other European countries that can point to what Germany did and say, why can't we do the same in selling our critical infrastructure? Please, sir.
Hello, I come from Serbian embassy, and my question would be how war in Ukraine is influencing China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Great.
So on the first question, and actually it also goes back to the very first question that Max asked, where I would kind of nuance the answer I gave before on this, which is I actually think one of the things that didn't happen was using on the European side, which was a failure and which should be reflected on, and to some extent was true on the US side as well, was using all of the normal tools, trade instruments and things like that, to be able to respond to a lot of these practices well ahead of time. Normal WTO processes, joint cases, just points to say, we're seeing what's going on, it's a problem, we will pull together collectively on this to say that this is not going to be something that we accept, and we will try and go through this through normal legal avenues. Because I think you have these kind of, this is where the solar case that I reference in the book, where it's just completely collapsed on the German side, because there is a view that actually you have to do this cooperatively, you have to figure these things out in the bilateral relationship, rather than if you go through and do a few exemplary cases much further ahead of time, do you set some limits at least in these areas on the Chinese side? I don't think this fixes the overarching structure of what we were dealing with, but I do think when it came to a few of these, the shocks that were experienced from specific industries, this rather kind of emboldened a view on the Chinese side that says we can pull the strings, we can play with this, we can go and complain to Merkel at the right moment and completely see DG trade undercut. I think the capacity to pull together earlier on that might have actually led to a view on the Chinese side that was a bit more restrained in terms of what they thought they could get away with. I think that was certainly a mistake. I think the mistakes in more recent years there's been a constant underestimation of how bad this can get on the Chinese, on the PRC side, frankly. I mean, I think we've now, there were a lot of rules of thumb that I think had been developed about how to think about China's kind of the way the system worked, parties' interests, all of these things that have been quite systematically overturned, and where all of the estimates have tended to be on the wrong side of this. I don't think people took what Xi Jinping was doing quite as seriously, took what stated goals were and stated policies were quite as seriously as they should have done, frankly, on all of this. And we've still got this to some extent coming out from Party Congress again. I think the view that was essentially some kind of dose still of China is in some sense or other economically pragmatic and will adjust its policies in light of that, rather than this fundamental kind of shift in a more ideological, securitized direction, I think is still not fully bedded in on the European policy side. I think there's still a framework that's still often feels a couple of years at least behind the new reality. So I'd say that in particular. Very briefly on the Belt and Road. I mean, I think the Belt and Road, I mean, it's now, of course, getting less prominence, even in its mention on the Chinese side. I think we're moving into this phase where Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative will achieve kind of higher relative prominence. The sheer array of debt renegotiations that are being undertaken by the Chinese government at the moment is becoming somewhat oppressive. I mean, if you look at not just Ukraine war itself, but the shock that's taken place across the developing world as a result of this, which was already underway during COVID. I mean, you just go through the inordinate list of renegotiations that were taking place during COVID, and you add to this the economic shock that's taken place on food and energy prices, inflation, a whole series of other things. It's now in a difficult place in a whole series of different countries, even kind of the core Belt and Road recipients. And I think the challenge for China is, are they going to go through and do actual debt write-offs, or are they going to keep trying to do the kind of rollovers and the model that they've had on these renegotiations before? And are they going to put really significant sums of new financing in? I think not. I mean, I think you've already had a big paring back of the risk appetite from the financial institutions on the Chinese side that I think is going to stick for some time to come, and is going to mean that you're not talking about this kind of speed and scale version of the Belt and Road that you had in the early years. And to some extent, I think China's going to just think differently about the real objectives that it had with the Belt and Road and the kind of the outcomes that it wanted to see from that. And if there are better ways of going about achieving them than just pumping lots of money into very, very large-scale infrastructure projects, I think the adjustments that are taking place to refocus more on the technology side, on green finance, a whole series of things like that, I think will also continue. I think you will come away from the scale things and end up, I think, a lot more targeted in terms of what China now does in the next phase. But I still think the debt piece of this is going to be quite critical, how China handles all of these crises. And I don't think there's a fully settled decision on that on the Chinese side yet.
Thanks, Andrew. Any final thoughts?
Can I just commend you, Andrew, on pulling together a really readable book? And I'd recommend to anyone who's here today and listening, whether you're familiar with the China debate over the past few years or not, I think you mentioned at one point the period from 2016 to 2019 in the China Rethink was more transformative than the preceding decade taken together. And 2020 and 2021 were momentous as well. And through interviews all across the world, you've pieced together, for those who are familiar or not just the individual episodes, but how they tied together in shifting European, EU and UK debate on China. For those who will soon read the book, I think the transformative effect of COVID on EU public opinion on China is something to look out for, and the role that U.S. EU relations have played in EU debate on China is also something to look out for. And I was struck by how the U.S. has, in some cases, been its own worst enemy in moving European debate on China in the direction it wants. And you go into Merkel-Trump interactions and the impact of the Snowden revelations on the Huawei decision. So look out for that. And then finally, I would also encourage readers to look out for, you conclude the book by looking at the new frontier of Europe and the West and China in the developing world, and implications for global governance. And I think that that's something to look out for, and a really striking way to end your book. So,
Well, with that, I really want to thank Andrew. We should all come together and applaud his book. But instead of we can do that, we will do that. But everyone should go out and buy it as well. It's a phenomenal read. Will make a lot of people want to join the think tank community. So we'll see our applications rise. But last thought is that it's just incredibly timely because. As the United States and Europe are looking ahead and how to deal with the China challenge, it has really brought to the fore the importance of getting on the same page as an alliance. And that's critical both in how we engage Russia, how we engage Ukraine, but also fundamentally how we engage this really momentous challenge of the century. So, Andrew, congratulations on the book. If you all join me in thanking Andrew, and thank you all for being here.